As far as Souls-like games go, Morbid: The Seven Acolytes isn't exactly subtle about its influences. Still, even though it joins many other indie titles as a deliberately tough adventure built around boss battles, there's a lot to enjoy and appreciate here, especially if you are a fan of the genre. Although it wears its inspiration on its sleeve, the execution of gameplay systems and the overall design still manages to offer something interesting even with so many Souls-like options around. One thing Morbid: The Seven Acolytes does well is how it carries the vibe of dark fantasy PC RPGs from yesteryear. This was back when games like Diablo and Baldur's Gate could only really be experienced on PC, and so Morbid certainly gives off that vibe as a mature PC classic from the mid-90s, carrying a similar vibe and presentation. As a dark fantasy game, Morbid certainly lives up to its name with its brooding visuals, extensive use of dull colors, and buckets of pixelated gore and blood. The setup is quite vague, with very little backstory as players find themselves in the role as the Striver, a savior of her world and the last of her kind. As players brave their way through uncharted territories, the initial vagueness slowly starts to piece together as the lore builds up. Taking inspiration from Lovecraftian horror, there are a lot of familiar and yet novel elements to discover. As players explore new areas, battle different enemies, visit desolate towns filled with grief-stricken residents, and eventually face the titular Acolytes, all of the different elements come together organically to create a world well worth investing in. Much of it is covered by the game's encyclopedia, but most of the subtext is conveyed through the characters and dialogue. Although it gets points for originality in its character designs and lore concepts, the experience itself feels largely similar to Dark Souls, but instead following the top-down loot-gathering sensibilities of something like Diablo. It's a pretty cool combination, and when it comes down to it, the various similar ideas create something which manages to stand out on its own. Much like any Souls experience, intensive and methodical combat forms a large part of the gameplay. The standard enemies are persistent, and they'll follow you to the ends of the earth. The mid-boss battles serve as formidable obstacles, and then there are of course the Acolytes. The Acolytes serve as pretty epic boss battles, each with their own backstory. These bosses are as granular as one would expect, but their patterns are readable enough to not get too infuriating after some practice. Combat would have been fine if it weren't for the handicap of the stamina bar, which greatly limits any possibilities of charging in. Stamina drains rather quickly and can be frustrating early on, but once you accept the terms of the game and take the more lethargic approach, things proceed a lot more smoothly. Ultimately, the game isn't necessarily difficult, it's just a matter of having the patience for a snail-paced progression. There is a sanity meter too, which serves as a secondary but less intrusive handicap, as not paying attention to sanity can impact combat ability and damage levels. Fans of other games in this genre will be familiar with the fine art of rolling and dodging, and it's become such a staple running joke of these games. Similar to those experiences, Morbid is all about rolling, and when in doubt, you just roll. There are blocks and parries too, but why do that when you can just do a barrel roll? Combat is quite satisfying given the number of upgrades and weapons available. Much like Diablo, it doesn't take too long to find all the cool weapons. Our hero can equip a melee weapon and firearms as well, with the latter serving quite useful to land a few big hits early on during a boss battle. Upgrades are achieved with the mini runes scattered about, which are attached to weapons for some handy stats and elemental tricks. Much like the Souls games, respite comes in the form of shrines, which serve as save and heal points. These are scattered quite generously throughout the game, and so as tough as it is, dying isn't really a huge deal, as you get to keep all your stuff and respawn at a convenient point. It's also at these shrines where our hero can upgrade her stats by attaching skill points to improve health, stamina, and other areas. Given all the weapons and skills, it doesn't take too long to build up the character to a point where progression feels comfortably steady. Although not always necessary, a little grinding for experience and loot can help with gaining an advantage. When it comes down to it, all the different moving parts in Morbid feel a tad deviated at first, but they come together to create something far greater than the sum of them. The uniqueness is largely thanks to the presentation of the world, which is varied in its level design and where there are plenty of secrets abound too, especially as players take on various side quests, which help with the overall immersion. Morbid: The Seven Acolytes is a challenging game which generally incorporates both the good and annoying elements of Souls-like experiences. Still, it manages to stand out thanks to its strong dark fantasy presentation, rich Lovecraftian lore, and gameplay systems that offer methodical combat and plenty of features to make the adventure satisfying. This game is difficult, but it doesn't forego quality of life features for the sake of being difficult, and so in this sense, many players outside the Souls fandom can get something out of it. Noisy Pixel is giving Morbid: The Seven Acolytes an 8.5 out of 10. Thank you for watching. Please read the full review at noisypixel.net. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers who work hard to deliver news, reviews, previews, and more. Please subscribe to keep up with all our future content.